there are 3,800 people who worked on Avatar, and that's, yeah, it's a pretty massive undertaking. And one of the great things about this is that I get to work with so many people in different areas as well. So, you know, for instance, the stunt team. There is no way that the stunt team and the composer would normally go out drinking together. But that seems to be what happens on Avatar, is that there is, because I was on set and because there were things, you know, and that's part of this thing that John and Jim have created, this Avatar family. I'm astonished. I mean, you know, and relieved. I think that, you know, when you're looking up at the screen every morning and you're starting to work, you know, you look at, and every day I would fall in love with the pictures again. And every day you sit there going, as new and new renders arrive. And so I knew that I still have there's these wonder moments in the film that I look at now, and I've seen them 10,000 times, and I still feel the same way that I did when I saw them the first time. You know, so I had a feeling that it was going to resonate. I'm astonished by the response. I'm astonished also by the response to the score. You know, the compliments are ridiculous, and the streaming numbers are astonishing. So I'm really quite flabbergasted.
For so many of us that love cinema and that love film music, James Horner has been one of the most important, one of the most resonant voices, and his music still continues to move all of us. And you know, he worked on so many iconic films. But you actually had the opportunity to work alongside him, first on Titanic in '97, and then on Avatar in 2009. So can you talk just a little bit about the story of how you first met him and what it was like working with him?
So my first, obviously my first introduction to James was Alan Silvestri had the same agent as James Horner, and I was working with Alan Silvestri, and the agent said to me, could you go and meet James? There is this film. And the first thing I got, so I talked to James, and the first thing he did is he wanted me to mock up a rough idea of a cue, which turned out to be the sinking from Titanic. I got it on a VHS cassette. That tells you everything about where we were at the time. And my thing was the use of electronics in films. I was, you know, I had a special skill, which is the way that I use computers and synthesizers in music. And so I was asked to sort of like work on that. And then I obviously subsequently worked on the whole of Titanic, mainly also because we had no money. So we had to create a lot of it using synthesizers and electronics. People find it hard to believe, but we were literally penniless. And I know I have told this story before, but the things like the famous synth patch, which is the "Take Her to See Mr. Murdoch," dun, 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 dun,
oh, that vocal patch! I love that
vocal patch. So I sort of made that up along with Ian Underwood, the other legend of synthesizers. I made out of 6 or 7 different synths in the synclavier. But the idea was that it would be replaced by the Harlem Boys Choir. But we had no money, so it stuck. We couldn't afford to hire them. And that was how penniless we were.
Right, because I remember hearing that the film itself was going way over budget, and everyone was talking about how it was going to be like a huge box office disaster. So there must have been a lot going on behind the scenes.
It was the screaming that was happening from various executives and things was fairly interesting at the time. So I then obviously I go off and do other things, and the next time he phones me up, James phones me up and says, I've got this other movie. I know you don't do this anymore, but would you come and look at this other movie, which was, and they showed me 5 minutes of Avatar. And so I looked at it and I said, yeah, okay, I get it. This is pretty special. And so we had they said, well, what do you think? And, you know, so do you want to do a week? And then we want to do a month. And then eventually I started at the end of January, and I finished on November the 22nd. And my role there was to do the stuff that was not orchestral. So it became things like I had when Jake looks around him in the forest, and there was the glowing forest and the wood sprites and all of that stuff. That was my area. Was the sort of the sound of the musical tactile feel of the stuff that wasn't strings, brass, woodwinds, and so on.
And at this point, was James still orchestrating and writing everything on paper?
He did a lot of that, but he was also we were working, collaborating. We had again with Ian Underwood, but we had our keyboards and we would set up. But my role sort of had expanded in this one, so that we created this title for me, which is Electronic Music Arranger. And that obviously didn't do too badly. And because I'd done I produced My Heart Will Go On Titanic, he then, we talked about the song in the end. I did the song with him, wrote the song with him for the end of Avatar. And there it came at this point where I realized that we actually had this fabulous working relationship. And it wasn't just James, although he was one of my closest friends. Subsequently we became very, very close. But it was also the whole crew. We worked beautifully together, and we started doing this more and more. And so over the subsequent scores that happened, and I sort of started to evolve my role. It became a thing. We ended up with a phrase which was score producer. And obviously at the point when James died, which is 2015, I was already into the theme park. We were doing the Pandora, the World of Avatar. James had written some themes, and I was starting to oversee the production of the music. And then Jim and John asked me to finish the park, and the park needed 5 hours of music, so there was a lot to do there. That I finished in May 2017. And December 2017, Jim calls me up and says, come and read the scripts. And it isn't just the script to 2, it's the scripts to all of them. And
yeah, because I remember hearing him say that he wanted to have the entire series, Avatars 2 through 5, completely written before he shot a single frame of any of the sequels.
And he also needed me to understand the arc, so that stuff that we were doing at the beginning might have references later on, and therefore it was important that I understood the story arc. And the first thing I did was write a song chord for Zoe.
Yeah, and that song chord theme is such an important, really integral part of the film, because we hear it at the very beginning, and it really establishes the tone, and then we, of course, hear it at the end, like in a very sort of reflective way after the battle sequence and after the big loss that we have in the third act of the film. So I'm curious for you, what was the journey like, first of all, writing the song chord, and then working with Zoe on set when she was recording all the motion capture and the vocal tracks for it?
Yeah. So I started writing that in January, probably February of 2018, sitting at the piano just working on it. And it needed to, Jim and I talked about it needing this sort of ancient feel, as if it was something from a time past. It was something that was handed down from generation to generation. Because the idea of the song chords is that you have a particular bead, a string of beads, that tells the life of a particular person. And that can be your new child, which is what she's doing at the beginning. She's putting the first beads on for Natayem, for Kiri as well. You'll hear the lyric for the give. I did lyrics for all of the children. We just didn't use them all. And the idea is that she's doing that, but it could well have been that she was reading the song chord of her great grandmother. and she could then read the life of her great grandmother by reading through the song chord and singing the song chord. The song chord is a life that you can sing, and so that was into, as you can see, it actually has a very, very crucial reason to exist in the film. So that then evolved into the family theme, as Jim calls it, which is I use in Leaving Home and so on. It's the same tune. And it was this idea that it was, that there are these, the mode that I've written this in is, it's just there to give this sense of, it's not quite major, it's not quite minor, it's sort of there to give this sense of just, I suppose the mystic of the sense of spirits. So that was the first thing. And then obviously from then, the next theme I wrote was based on, and again, I wrote this off the script, was what I called, which initially was called Skimming the Waves, but it actually had two themes in the same piece. I just wrote it straight off the script, reading the point where the Tulkun return. And it has, the opening is the Payakan theme, the dum bum bum ba bum bum ba da 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 da, and then it goes into da 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 dum ba da da, and that was a single whole piece. And I will probably, and I use that in the end credits at some point. I may actually I'll try and persuade somebody to release that one day.
So Avatar 2 is coming out 13 years after the original Avatar film, and I was 9 years old when it came out. So what were the conversations like when you first sat down with James Cameron talking about how you were going to approach this sequel 13 years later, and what kind of elements you were going to bring from the first score into this new one, and what was going to be new and fresh about Avatar: The Way of Water?
We talked about what he felt was successful and what was not successful about the Avatar 1 score. We have this sort of thing where we sit down and we analyze and go through, and he talked to me and said, I loved the score, I loved the feeling, I loved the texture. What I felt was that the themes were too amorphous. They weren't connected with particular characters. He wanted something where themes were more character focused. So there's more like a leitmotif. There is, you have the Siegfried theme or whatever, if you were going back to your Wagner. But the idea that there is a more character connected musical thing, rather than the sort of thing where on A1, there were some phenomenal themes. But they happened once often. They would only happen here and then never happen again, and weren't connected so much to people or things. And he wanted something where the themes were more connected to the characters. That was the first thing. The second thing was that he asked me for more muscular action music. It was something that he felt that we could improve in terms of his approach to how he wanted to go. And we charted out the themes we were going to need. So obviously we had the family theme. That was going to be the spine. That was the spine of the film. And you can see I use it in variations throughout the score. And that's the one there when Jake is saying, I can protect this family, on French horns. But it's there also for when they swim, when there's darkness to light, when they are swimming from the very bottom to the surface. I'm using it in a slight variation there, in a more major way, but a hopeful way that's climbing up. It's meant to have pathos, and I started on solo cello, and then it expands to the whole orchestra. So I use variations of it. I use it in Happiness is Simple, on woodwinds, in a very subtle way. I'm still using the percussion stuff, the rhythms I'd created for A1, we're still using that in this, but you know, it's that thing. And then, for instance, when Jake and Neytiri goes flying that first time, that's the appropriate time to use the ICU, because that's them. And Jim and I talked about that being Jake and Neytiri's theme. That when they're together, especially when they're flying, ba-da-da-da, so that's appropriate, and that was the use for that, is that when we saw Jake and Neytiri doing things, and I started expanding that to be when we use it as a leitmotif for some of those action sequences, when Jake and Neytiri are doing their double teaming, which they often do in this film, then I might bring that in with two phrases, like a friend, ba-da-da-da-da-da-da, you know, use the two phrases of that thing as Jake and then Neytiri. And that was a conscious decision. So we had those two. We had a Jake Neytiri from A1. We now had a family theme, which is going to act as the spine for the score. Then we needed the Metcaina connection with water theme, which is I use it in variations. So the first swim, the into the water, right, where I have the mermaids singing to them as they jump into the water. And it's also used in The Way of Water, which is when we have the poem. And then in its fullest form, it's used on The Return of Talcun. And that is the same theme.
When you first get to the Metcaina tribe and you go underneath the water for the first time, first of all, it's mind-blowing visually in IMAX 3D, just seeing the level of craftsmanship with the VFX. But with the music, what I love so much about your approach is creating that glistening, sort of sparkling, shining quality. So how did you make the decision that you were going to create that texture for the Metcaina, and what was the process like as that evolved, creating the score?
Well, that was a specific request from Monsieur Cameron. He said, I want this feeling of the light coming through water on a shallow, and we talked about the way the light goes through water when you've got shallow compared to deep. I mean, this is the sort of thing we talk about. But he said there's that point when the water comes down onto the bottom, the sand, and there's that iridescence as the light hits the bubbles and so on. And there's that aquamarine color that is that sort of that near shore feel of you know, like the Bahamas and Bora Bora and so on, and that sort of color that you've got there. And he talked very much about needing this iridescence. And so I created this thing where we got 5 percussionists, and we found everything that was the lightest, the most lightest, delicatest textures we could find, and including like hanging strings of keys, which you just sit there and just play randomly. And then there's a thing called a mark tree or a bell tree that everyone, you know, that Tinkerbell, right? Now, we don't use it like that. In this case, I made them play one by one individual of the metal rods just to get this crystal. And then we had several of those, and we had things called crotales. We had a number of things, all the highest, most delicate things, all play. Rather than bashing them, for instance, we would play them either with fingers or with brushes. And I put this into a 3-dimensional array that Simon Rhodes recorded, so that you get this feeling that it is everywhere. And that was an essential texture. It's something I used throughout the film.
Now, I have to admit, I'm a bit of like a James Cameron fanboy.
Absolutely.
I've seen every interview with him. I've taken his masterclass. I'm really interested at how he's always looking ahead, and he's such a visual storyteller as well. I have his book, Tech Noir, where it goes through all of the drawings that he created for all of his films, from Alien to Titanic. And I love that he's able to really constantly maintain a really close connection with all of his crew on these films. So what was the process like for you working with James to create the score?
It's great because there are really, I have 2 people I have to please. First of all, I have to please myself, and then I have to please him, and nobody else. And it doesn't matter. No one else can have an opinion. Nobody else's opinion matters. That gives you an incredible clarity, because basically it only gets through if Jim likes it. And that's true. And we have a thing called the shit art boundary. Up to 99% is shit and 100% is art, right? And that I might everything I had to do, as far as he was concerned, had to break that shit art boundary. And so that's as simple as I can put it. It is challenging. You know, he did give me all of 6 minutes off in this film. You know, so I had to do 3 hours of score between the songs.
But you actually wrote like way more than 3 hours or something, like
Close to
5 hours.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Which is somewhere I've got them here.
Oh, the full scores.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Right. I saw the pictures of this.
Here they are. So the scorebooks are
amazing.
I mean, that's
wow. Look at that.
That's I mean, the staggering amount of music.
Unbelievable.
And
so did you follow sort of the same approach as Avatar 1 in that you had all of the pre-records basically designed, and then when you went in for the sessions, you just muted all the orchestral arrangements that you did virtually and re-recorded on top of all the pre-records?
yeah, and often, you know, my demos are very good because that was my day job, was the electronics. So that gave Jim a very good idea of where we went. And then obviously once it comes to the final, then Jim he likes to play. So he gets to evolve the music. You know, he might tweak things, move things here, take something from here, put it over there. And that was the same in Avatar. It was the same in Titanic. You know, Jim, there's a point where you stop owning the music and Jim owns the music. And then you allow that to happen.
I love that you were talking about you only have to please two people, yourself and James Cameron, because it sort of proves that idea that James Cameron is working outside of the traditional studio system where you have to please, you know, 15 executives in order to get something through. So can you talk just a bit about that, like more specifically what you're talking about in terms of James Cameron's leadership on the team?
It's entirely Jim. I mean, that's the thing that people don't understand. For you know, we all work, and you know, there are these great professionals throughout in every single craft. They're phenomenal, but there is one guiding vision above all of this.
So of course, when you're working as a film composer, you're getting in pretty primitive visual effects as you're sort of scoring the film. And as you get closer and closer to the release date, the visual effects start to get even more polished. So what was it like specifically on Avatar, which is almost entirely a VFX work, performance capture, seeing the VFX sort of coming in and getting better and better and better until it gets literally photorealistic?
Oh, it's like Christmas. No, I mean, really. So you take that thing when the kids jump in the water. We had these rough renders, and then one day we were doing a thing called D23, which is a Disney thing, and suddenly the render for that appears, and you just sit there going, "Oh, holy heck!" And just I think we all, you know, my team, everybody, once this came in, you just sort of go, "This is astonishing." And then new renders would appear for different scenes all the time, you know. So there were some that were locked early. For instance, the Parents from Hell scene, the attack on the show, that was locked in pretty early, and that was something that was, you know, again, astonishing scene. And there are other things like that 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 you get, but basically it's just gifts every week when Weta turned over new renders. But there is a downside to this, because sometimes I would write a piece of music to what we call a template, one of the earlier versions, and Jim would say to me, "No, he's smiling there," or he raises his eyebrow here, and I can't see that because it's not in the version that I have. And so maybe there's a twist of a tone. Maybe I need to change perspective at that point, not 4 seconds later, because what I'm just seeing is a rough outline of a face.
When you first get to the Metcaina tribe and there's those beautiful shots going over the reefs and you see where they live and you're sort of establishing the location, there's that moment when the time signature sort of changes and you're in the track Sanctuary, and then the vocals come in and it is just so, like, I was just getting chills. It's an amazing moment. So can you talk about how you chose to maintain the use of choral elements, of vocal elements in Avatar 2, and specifically how it was different for this new tribe versus the forest tribe?
So there was a very specific thing that I decided, which was that the Metcaina are a slightly more simple, more traditional village, and also they're a sea tribe, so their vocal sound should be different to that hard, edgy texture that had been created for Avatar 1. I still had Terry and Clydeen, who are the core of that vocal sound from A1. They still came along, but when we go to the Metcaina village, what we're actually hearing is some Polynesian singers that I recorded in Wellington from different islands in the South Pacific. And that was a conscious decision. I wanted a softer, sort of slightly more longer, elongated tone rather than this rather clipped hard thing. The kappas, all of that stuff, this became a softer texture. And that was my decision, that the Metcaina needed to have a slightly longer thing. There's a thing with nomadic and sea tribes where their lines tend to have the longer texture, rather than being this really hard thing that we were using in the Omaticaya. And that was something I also wanted to do.
People that are film composers know that writing a 5-minute long action scene or a 10-minute long action scene is hard. Sometimes you have 15-minute scenes in Mission Impossible movies or 20-minute scenes or whatever, but there is an hour-long plus action scene in Avatar: The Way of Water. It just keeps going, and it is constantly interesting to watch. But what was it like putting together these huge action set pieces with your music, and how were you able to keep it interesting and engaging throughout such a big, long action set piece?
There is a thing in this case. I mean, I think you can say that the action starts at the point when Loak goes out to save Payakan. There is this harpoon in, the pinger is attached to him, and that's the kickoff point. And from that point, we have these two tribes, basically the RDA, and we have the Na'vi heading towards where they're going to go. And everything amps up. And one of the things that, in terms of writing this score, was that I use tempo. Obviously, there's a lot of variable tempos. I'm using orchestral textures, and I'm using, percussion, voices. The actual peak, I think, of the action is the point when the ship hits the water and goes slap. Then we're into a whole other thing, because then it becomes, it's a now just man against man in this case. But yeah, so the Jake and Quaritch fight is the biggest cue. I mean, it's a humongous thing. I wrote that during we did some tests in late 20, I think it was, something like that. And that scene was slightly different, so we tweaked it a bit. But I started writing that as we were trying out some things, because one of the problems is I had rushing water, which is terrible for music. Great big white noise machine. So everything, you have to find your way through that. I have clanking metal. I have machine guns. I have helicopters. All of the things that sit there and basically eviscerate anything that is musical. And I had to sort of create this arc. The arc, you're right, it's about an hour. And there are some cues I had to rewrite a few times, because Jim said to me, there was the Na'vi attack. I had written as a more traditional orchestral cue with lots of sort of things, and he said to me, "Yeah, but I like what you did on Train Attack and the beginning. So can you take an element of that?" And so I rewrote that. So that's like 5-6 minutes gets thrown away, and I'll put that on some, that's in the vault for some other time. Maybe he'll like it. But those are the things the orchestra I'm adding as I go through. There isn't a conscious decision of how you make that build, because the picture is telling you. We're above water. We've got we're not at night. Like if we've got machine guns and stuff, I've got to stay out of that. So I use French horns a lot as for themes because they cut through a lot of the chaos. When I don't have the machine guns, then I'm using strings for ostinatos. So because they're a great drive. The drums I have to be careful with, because if you use drums with machine guns, they don't work very well. If you use big, low brass stuff with groaning ship stuff, that gets in the way because you can't tell what's the low brass and what's the groaning ship. So voices are very useful because voices can cut through pretty well anything. We have an instinct to listen for a human voice. And that's part of why I use voices in those action scenes the way that I do, because it still cuts through. And there is this arc to this point where I think probably, that there is the point when the final fight stops, and I had everybody playing as loud as they possibly could with everybody, and the choir singing, and the Navi voice, and everybody just hammering to that point, and then it just stops, and there's this release.
And you just can't take your eyes off of it. You're glued in.
There were a few times where I would stop because I wanted to clear a line, and Jim would say, "No, you can't do that. We need to keep going. We can't ever let the audience off." I had a thing where it stopped on bloody hell, and I held it and allowed the line to come through, and then Jim said, "No." And he was right, because you need that sense. You can never let the audience from going, and he doesn't. He is the absolute master of action.
One of the things I was wondering is actually, what is it like to work on a $400 million movie? Is it very different from working on a film of a smaller budget, or how would you describe the sort of working on this kind of scale?
There is, I don't mean this to be hyperbole, there is really every other film an Avatar. It is a fundamentally different process, because first of all, I get brought in right at the beginning, and now obviously composers sometimes come in early on. You might have a thing, but this is part of that thing that Jim wants, this idea of a coherent process. So the costume designer, the props master, the production designer had a thing called Culture Club, that we would work together to make sure that our cultural references for the Na'vi were coherent as a whole, that we would actually talk with each other. Why would I talk to Deb Scott, the costume designer, and why would I talk to the production designer, to Dylan Cole? That's what one of the things. First of all, is this utter attention to detail to the most ridiculous degree. And the second thing is that it never finishes. There is never good enough is never good enough.
Do you remember how long before the release date on December 16th? Or I think the premiere in London was early December. So how long before that did you deliver the final score?
I recorded the last cue in Los Angeles. I flew back because I was mainly in New Zealand, but I flew back to Los Angeles for the last sessions. I recorded the last cue on November the 21st in Los Angeles, and then did the strings for the weekend song and did the vocals with Abel in Los Angeles. Then I flew back on the 22nd. We mixed it on November the 23rd. It went into the film as it was being mixed. We print mastered the film on November the 24th. It was finally mastered on December the 1st, and the premiere was December the 6th. So, and we flew from New Zealand to London for the premiere, as we'd pretty much just after finished it.
And so John Landau is James Cameron's longtime producer. They've worked together for decades. So How involved is John in terms of the music and your process as a composer?
He's an essential. He's the essential. There is John. If Jim is the engine, John is the motor oil. Everything runs because John's, makes sure that everything runs together. And an engine without motor oil would just go. And he is the most astonishingly supportive, proactive producer I've ever seen.
Can you talk a little bit about the actual process of recording the score, how big the orchestra was, and you said you recorded in Los Angeles. So what were the scoring sessions like?
I had usually the score. The total orchestra was about 100. I started in LA, and then Jim said, "You need to come back to New Zealand with me so we can work whilst I'm editing, so that I can be in New Zealand." So the whole large chunks. I started my first sessions were back end of July, and then I came straight back to New Zealand. All of the subsequent sessions were remote, where I would sit and then I would have various. I had people like we remoted the session in, and Anthony Parthner was conducting, or Mike Valerio, and or Bill Ross, and they would conduct remotely, and I would annoy everybody by having opinions, and that worked very well, but it's not quite the same. And then for the last sessions, I just said to Jim, I need to go home and be with my people, and so they gave me 48 hours. So I flew back, did the 48 hours to do the session, came straight back, and it was great to be there for the final sessions.
I have another question about James Cameron. I'm curious, from someone who's really interested in director-composer relationships, what is something that you think we can learn from the way that James Cameron approaches the director-composer collaboration, or that relationship? I have a feeling he's someone who's really involved, is really engaged, but what are the elements that we can learn from in terms of how he approaches that?
First of all, I think with any director, and I'll say take this as a more general thing, you have to allow people to make mistakes, because in the mistakes is where you often find the magic. Things, it's like the wrong notes in jazz. Sometimes the wrong notes are where the good stuff comes, and Jim allows for the fact that you can evolve an idea. That's really important. So I'd say that was the first thing, is that you allow your composer to not have to get it right the first time. Because now in some cases I did. Some cases there was a cue, like now it might be the first time he sees it. But Payakan, when we see Payakan the first time, I wrote that for myself 11 times before I gave it to Jim. Then Jim saw it and went, I love this. And it never changed after that point. So Into the Water, the kids swimming, I did that 6 or 7 times until I showed it to Jim. Then Jim went, I love this. And it never changed again. So that was the first, he saw that once, he said, this is great. It never evolved. It never changed. There are other times when he says to me, no, like the swim out from the bottom of the sea, from the bottom of the wreck. We did that 3 times, where I just, he said, you need to get me crying the whole way through. And at the point I had him in tears the whole way through, that was when it was locked. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is with Jim, he likes to have the music and then puts it in the Avid and then starts playing with it. Now he's very good at it. He's very good at giving me back ideas and saying, what about this? And that's a great thing. I think also there is, with other directors, I've had, there are directors I work with where there is no temp score, but Jim uses, and that's great because you just do what you feel. With Jim, he uses the temp as his explanation. He may not be able to talk about it in musical terms, but he can show me a temp to show me how he feels. And then it's my interpretation of how he feels that is important.
With regards to James Horner, you think about the work that he's done, when you think about Legends of the Fall, when you think about Glory, when you think about Titanic, Braveheart. His scores are still just as present and alive and powerful as they've ever been, even now. So you had a really rare opportunity to actually work alongside him and be there during so many of his greatest scores, his greatest works. So can you talk about what he was like as a friend, what he was like as a composer through your eyes?
As a friend, he was, one of my utter closest friends. And he would phone up, and my son would pick up the phone, and who was, say, 8 or 9 at the time, and James would sit there talking to him, and I would say to Luca, who's on the phone? Because he'd be talking for like 5, 6, 7 minutes to somebody. We didn't know who. Oh, James is on the phone. And James would be chatting away to my son, and there was never... And that was the sort of thing, so we had a lovely, it was a warm relationship that I enjoyed. As a composer, his ability to understand how to reflect the emotion on screen, I think, was his biggest thing. Obviously, there's the tunes, you accept that. There is that way he uses counterpoint, so the way that idea that there is the tune and the bass, and then there's sort of the middle is almost a sort of not much going on. That says, and there have been volumes written about this, but the clarity it gives when you put it against picture is quite astonishing, in that you can throw a gazillion things against it and it still works. And that is a difficult skill. People seem to think sometimes that they must add all of this extra filigree in to make something sound wonderful. And it may sound wonderful in its own right. As a score, you need to do, you actually have to do less sometimes. And James was a master of getting a theme through and actually making the music sit in picture.
You've had decades of experience in the industry. You've worked on the biggest films like Avatar and like Titanic. And there's going to be a lot of people that are going to see this film and hear your music and say, that's something that I want to do. Or, it's going to inspire a lot of people. So for composers that are yet to be, or composers that are working right now to pursue this as a venture, what would you say to them? What would be your words of advice to aspiring composers?
Learn from your mistakes. Don't make them twice. That's the first thing. Secondly, understand that you're going to spend a decade earning nothing. that's the and say yes to everything early on. It doesn't matter whether it's a training film. It doesn't matter if it's an ad. I did adverts for years. There was I did loads of commercials when I was in my 20s, and these are all those attempts where somebody else pays you to learn, because getting paid is the most important thing at this point. Because if you're unemployed and you have to go and become an accountant, or you have to become, you have to run a fish and chip shop, that takes away from the time that you have as a composer. So it is important that what you're trying to do is write music. That's your main thing. So anything, and you never know who the person making that industrial film that you just scored, 10 years time, they're on the same journey. They may be the next Ridley Scott, who, and so on.
I cannot wait to hear your work on the following Avatar films. And I know there's a lot of really interesting stuff coming in terms of new tribes, new sounds, new worlds. So I have a feeling you're going to knock it out of the ballpark. So congratulations on your work.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been great to be here. And Ashton, it's been a very enjoyable interview.
I'm a warrior like you. I'm supposed to fight. Protect the people. Let's get it done.